So for today's event, two weeks ago, actually, we had a very engaging session about the teaching of writing in the new normal. And one of the major concerns brought into the discussion is assessment and testing. So today, we're honored to have an international scholar who will share with us his expertise on language assessment literacy. Our speaker is Assistant Professor at the Department of Linguistics at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He is also an Affiliate Assistant Professor at the Second Language Acquisition and Teacher Education, Educational Psychology, and Center for East Asian and Pacific Studies. Currently, he is the Director of the English Placement Test in the same university. In 2018, he is the recipient of the Lincoln Excellence Award for Assistant Professor. His broad research interests include language testing and assessment, English for academic purposes, educational measurement, and quantitative research methods. His publication has appeared in various top-tier academic journals, including Language Testing, TESOL Quarterly, System, and Journal of Language Testing and Assessment. Everyone, join me to welcome our speaker for this session, Assistant Professor Shunyan.
All right, thank you, Joy, for the wonderful introduction. And I would like to first thank Dr. Pompimo and the EIL committee for extending this invitation for me to speak about language testing and assessment. And I will start to share my screens. All right, so today I'd like to talk a little bit more about language assessment literacy and especially how that's being conceptualized and how that has been practiced in the training of different stakeholders. So first, I'd like to clarify that this is not meant to be sort of a language testing or language assessment training. It's really just about the sharing of some current conversations or discussions that we have in relation to language assessment literacy and how that relates to teacher education or professional development in multiple areas. So I'll be talking about different stakeholder groups in the talk. Although I'll be making practical implications or suggestions related to the development of language assessment literacy, but the talk will be mainly kept at the conceptual level. But if you have any questions about specifics related to language assessment literacy development, please feel free to ask during the Q&A sessions. All right, so the outline of today's talk, I will first by talking about the significance of language assessment literacy, why that is important. And then I'll be moving on to talk about the conceptualization of LAL or assessment literacy. Starting from there, I'll be discussing how language assessment literacy can develop. And I will also propose a conceptual model towards LAL development based on my empirical research over the past few years. And at the end, I'll make some practical suggestions for teacher education or professional development in general for people in applied linguistics. So to start with, I would like to have an activity, and this is an activity that I actually enjoy having in most of my conversations with whether it's students in language testing or colleagues and students in other areas. And the first question I want to ask you is, what areas of study are important to language testing? So think about your experience related to assessment or any conversations that you've had about language testing, and scan the QR code if you can on your phone, and that will lead you to a survey. So the survey actually has 2 questions, so feel free to complete both, and then I will show your responses on my end, and then just look at how people think about the field of language testing and how people think about language assessment literacy. So hopefully everybody is able to scan this QR code. And now I'm going to switch screen to the survey. Seems like the numbers are pretty stable at this moment. So if you can see here, This is a very interesting distribution of answers that I've had. So according to our responses, item writing seems the most relevant area of study according to related to language testing, and is followed by language pedagogy, then teacher education statistics, second language acquisition, and measurement and psychometrics. And there are only 3% of people who've selected theoretical linguistics. Well, 3% select computer science, and nobody selected research design, and 3% select psychology. Okay, so that's the first answer. So I want you to think about this results, and then we'll come back to this as we go in this presentation. So in the second question, I asked, what knowledge and skills does a language tester need? Oops, so the numbers are still moving. So yeah, keep in mind there are 2 items on the survey, just to make sure that you complete both. Yeah, so this is actually the results from all of us in this room. Maybe I should switch to, so this is our responses to the first question. As you can see, is what I just described. So it started with the highest number is item writing, then it's followed by pedagogy, and it's followed by statistics and measurement. And then very few people selected psychology, research design, or theoretical linguistics. Well, there are 5% of participants who've selected computer science. So this is an interesting result because it seems to be a little bit different from my survey when it's conducted here in the US. And I can tell you that in the States, when I ask this question, the highest number is item writing, as you also selected. Then immediately following item writing is statistics and measurement. So I'm very happy to see that language pedagogies also make to the top 3 list. That's a striking difference there. But so try to remember the results, at least the general pattern, as we'll come back to these patterns later. But now I'm going to show you our responses to the next question. So I asked, what knowledge and skills does a language tester need? Right. So this is really getting at language assessment literacy and trying to get your perception before we start. And the highest number is teaching methods, which is also a very interesting difference here. And it's followed by writing skills, linguistics expertise, then it's decision making. And then we have a couple of ties, communication skills, research design, knowledge of psychology. And interestingly, statistics is ranked the least, which is only 3% here. So that's an interesting pattern of knowledge and skills that people think a language tester should have. So now I'm going to switch back to my slides. I've talked quite a bit about the importance of LAL. You might wonder, so how do we define it? What does it really mean, right? And especially we've done the survey questions at the very beginning. And in fact, the conceptualization of language assessment literacy has evolved over time. In the 1990s, the assessment literacy has been discussed quite a bit in the field of general education, where assessment literacy has been promoted in professional development for all teachers, not just in language, but in all content subjects. And LAL has been defined mostly as some kind of knowledge about assessment. But starting in 2008, scholars in language testing specifically developed definitions about assessment literacy for language testing or language education professionals. And according to Alan Davies, he conceptualized assessment literacy as comprising knowledge, skills, and principles. And later on, Imbat-Laurie in 2008 added the importance of considering sociocultural dimension of language testing. And Glenn Fulcher in 2012 added even more dimensions. And he argued not only sociocultural dimensions is important to language testing, but also the historical, sociopolitical, and philosophical dimensions of language testing are worth considering when we practice language testing. So I'll give you a little bit brief definition of LAL according to these scholars in the next slide. Or according to Stiggins in 1991, LAL is really just a basic understanding of the development and use of educational assessment to measure student achievement. This is a very broad definition, but don't get me wrong, it's still, even though it's very broad, it's still, I would say, the most widely adopted definition for language assessment literacy or assessment literacy in general. Because of the general nature of this definition, it can be easily applied to multiple contexts in language assessment. But according to Alan Davies, as I mentioned, he defined assessment literacy in terms of skills, knowledge, and principle. According to him, skills means the practical skills or know-how in test analysis or test construction, such as item writing skills, statistics, skills related to measurement, right? These all fall under the skills. And there's the knowledge component mostly refers to relevant background, mostly theoretical knowledge about measurement and about language description. So what's interesting is if you look into the previous literature, most of the scholars who are trying to define assessment literacy or language assessment literacy has clearly indicated the importance of theoretical linguistics. And yet, as our data has shown, and in fact, my data in other contexts have shown that knowledge or expertise related to theoretical linguistics is often overlooked when describing language assessment literacy, or when you try to examine the actual practice related to language assessment. So that's something I would like to stress, and I'll come back to that point later as well. For principles, these principles in assessment generally refer to some of the reasons or rationales behind testing and assessment. And these reasons are mostly explored within a social and historical context. Issues related to ethics in language testing or fairness or social justice all fall under this category, this principle category. So you can see the concept started to become wider and wider and start to encompass multiple elements now. And it's not just about technical skills. But Imbar-Lori really pushed this conceptualization to a much higher level. According to her, the social context, a sociocultural context, is at the heart of language assessment literacy. And she had a clear reason for this. According to her, language assessment literacy, or the conversations revolving around assessment literacy, has been mostly about the training or professional development for language teachers. And in many contexts, language teachers express concerns about assessment because they tend to think that testing is all about statistics, about measurement, about highly technical skills. And a lot of teachers might develop certain kind of resistance towards training in assessment, simply because they don't feel comfortable learning more about numbers or learning about item writing skills. So her goal is to actually differentiate between two types of culture. The first type of culture is what she referred to as culture of testing, which is related to those technical skills, item writing, psychometrics, measurement, statistics. That's the kind of skills and culture that resides in a lot of testing companies, where people handle lots of large-scale data. But she also emphasized this culture of assessment, which is more linked to classroom context, where teachers play an essential role in developing knowledge and learning knowledge about assessment. So she argues very important to focus on formative assessment when we talk about language assessment literacy. And we should, by all means, empower language teachers in both learning and creating knowledge about language testing and assessment. And Glenn Fulcher, right, after all these conceptual expansion in 2012, Glenn Fulcher developed an even more expanded definition of language assessment literacy. And I'm putting the original quote here. As you can see, it covers quite a bit of elements under this construct. But what I would like to emphasize here is that he considered the ability to place knowledge, skills, processes, principles, and concepts within the wider historical, social, political, and philosophical frameworks in order to understand why certain practices have become what they are now, and to evaluate the role of testing in relation to the larger society and the impact of testing on individuals. So you can see the direction of these conceptual expansion is to move gradually away from considering testing as only technical skills, statistics, to more and more sociocultural understanding or sociopolitical understanding of assessment literacy. So it's really getting at the question of why we're doing testing and how we can use assessment and testing to help with teaching and learning. Right? So I think that's a very healthy movement for us to better understand what kind of contributions language testing as a field can contribute or should contribute to foreign language education in general. So along with this conceptual expansion comes with a lot of key points that scholars been making. And in fact, I would argue that this conceptual expansion of LAL is a result of all these arguments that scholars have made. So these arguments include, for example, there's all stakeholders, and that language is not necessarily the case, and there's no perfect test for all. And instead, we need to focus on what assessment methods that should be developed within that particular assessment context. So we need to seek for context-specific assessment solutions. And last but not the least, stakeholders might differ in their assessment literacy profiles. That is, they might have different interests, needs, and expectations in assessment practices. And according to Taylor, because different stakeholders might have different interests and different needs and expectations, Taylor has designed this concentric circles to classify different type of stakeholders. According to her, at the core, we have language testing researchers and language test creators or test makers, people like item writers for testing companies or organizations who are who are tasked to design assessment methods for classrooms. So these group of stakeholders is at the core of language testing. But in the intermediary circle, we have language teachers who deal with both large-scale tests and classroom-based assessments, and yet they don't have to analyze large-scale data, right? They just have to use assessment in their daily teaching context. What's at the peripheral circle are the policymakers. For example, people in the admissions office at most universities. Those people need to look at their international students' proficiency scores and make a decision about whether they can be admitted to the university. Or in many EFL contexts, a lot of people in the admissions office need to look at their English test scores to determine whether they can be enrolled into English language heavy programs, right, at the university. And of course, the general public is also included in this circle. Because different stakeholder groups might have different interests and expectations, Taylor has also designed this, what the field calls the Spiderweb Model, to look into how we can actually better characterize the expectations of language assessment literacy for different stakeholder groups. So she listed specified four different stakeholder groups. For option A here, she had the profile for test writers or item writers. As you can see, the item writers are expected to have very high scores on knowledge of assessment theory, technical skills, like item writing skills, and principles and concepts related to assessment. but relatively low on personal beliefs and attitudes about assessment, as most of the time they just need to write the test items, right? They're also ranked low on local practices because when item writers create test items, especially for large-scale testing companies, they cannot just write test items for a particular context. So they have to write generally and very broadly for multiple contexts, right? So you can kind of expect the profile is described such that they don't have an even profile across all different elements. So you can also see from this graph that Taylor divides assessment literacy into multiple subcomponents, like assessment theory, technical skills, principles and concepts, language pedagogy, and sociocultural values related to assessment, and local assessment and teaching practices, personal beliefs, and last, score and decision making. So what I want to direct your attention to in this particular graph is the profile B and the profile D. Profile B is the profile for language teachers. So you can see here, according to Taylor, and she assigned the highest score for language pedagogy among language teachers, which is quite understandable, and high on local practices and technical skills. But if you look deeper into technical skills, that skill mostly refers to item writing or the ability to design tasks, but much lower on principles and concepts related to testing and knowledge of assessment theory. Right? So we can see that this profile differs dramatically from the profile of test writers. But if you look at option D here, this is the profile for professional language testers. And this is a clear, well-rounded profile that she thinks that all language testers possess or should possess. But one thing to think about now that you see this different profiles, you can start to ask yourself whether you think these different categorizations actually make sense. And then keep coming or think back at this question as we go along the talk today. One thing I would also like to note is that there's further development of this model done by Baker and Riches in 2018, where they've actually based their conceptual models on their work in Heidi, looking into how language teachers and language testing professionals collaborate with each other in designing assessment. She also noted that language testers and language teachers have very different profiles, and that can be discussed, that can be characterized in the graph on the right. But what's interesting is that if you look at this graph, the solid circle or the solid lines refer to the profile of professional language testers. And we can see the profile for these professional or assessment professionals already differ from the profile D in Taylor's conceptual model, right? So we can start to see that in empirical research, we didn't seem to replicate this well-rounded profile among language testers. Hopefully I'm not giving too much away at this moment, but that might be a hint for you to think about. Is it actually possible to have a well-rounded profile in language testing? So I've talked quite a bit about what language assessment literacy is, according to some of the theoretical discussions that we have so far in the field. So a quick summary on LAL is that the concept of LAL has become increasingly expensive. And the field has moved away from focusing exclusively on technical skills or large-scale tests to a more sociocultural and sociopolitical view towards language testing and assessment, and start to incorporate classroom-based assessment when we think about our practice. And another important message from this conceptual expansion or this conceptual development is that stakeholders need not master all aspects of language assessment literacy. It's important to know that there are multiple elements covered under assessment literacy, but definitely there are differences in interests, needs, and expectations in relation to assessment practices across stakeholder groups. So I've talked quite a bit. If there's any clarification questions that you want to ask or anything you want me to elaborate a bit more, I think it might be a good time to take a very, very brief break so that I can, if there's any questions, then I can take.
All right, I guess anyone from our audience would like to throw a very quick question. Should you have any clarification?
If not, I can move on as well.
Right, I guess everyone is good.
Okay, great. All right, so now that's the conceptual understanding of language assessment literacy. The next big question, especially the question that the field of language testing is tackling now, is how can we describe the development of language assessment literacy, right? We know what language assessment literacy is, but how can we ensure that we can design the best or high quality assessment training programs or procedures that can facilitate assessment literacy development? And this is a difficult question because any kind of question that tap into development is difficult, especially if you're familiar with research in second language acquisition, or if we have teachers who've been involved in language teaching for years, we know that in order to better describe a development process, it takes time. We have to track people over time. And the same applies to assessment literacy development. But based on the research that we have now, I haven't seen, or there's very few study that has tracked stakeholders over time and examined their assessment literacy development. However, there have been studies that have used reflective techniques like interview questions or stimulated recall to ask participants or stakeholders to reflect upon their own development process, things that they've regretted or things that they've learned or things that they've appreciated when they learned or studied language testing. So again, there's another activity here. Before I give away what I think the current trend or the status quo of assessment literacy development, I want to ask you this question. What is, in your view, or in your experience, what's the best way to study language testing? Is it by taking a course in language testing, or developing a language test, or by teaching a language course, or by taking language tests? So I'm going to switch again to, and okay, so I'm going to lock here. So over 50% of us think that it's very important, or the best way to learn language testing is by actually developing a language test, right? Just to see how it goes, right? To get some hands-on experience related to testing or test development. And also for about 40% of us think that it's also important, or maybe taking a course in language testing is the best way to study language testing. So it's very interesting how these results pan out. So now I'm going to switch back to our slides here. And the reason I designed this question is that the current understanding or the traditional view of language assessment literacy training is such that all stakeholders should take a course in language testing. That is, they have to learn testing systematically. And it's a very top-down approach where, in these lectures or these training programs, the stakeholders are going to be instructed on assessment theory, technical skills, how to write test items, and then later on, they're left alone to practice their own assessment activities. So it has shown some interesting group differences. So for a certain group of learners, taking a course in language testing seems to be the most efficient. And they can systemize the range of knowledge and expertise involved in language testing. Then they can gradually apply those knowledge and expertise in actual test practice. But more and more recently, research started to show it's probably more important to actually get stakeholders involved in test development process. The actual hands-on experience will actually make a difference when developing assessment literacy. I will expand on these notions in this section. And of course, teaching a language course and taking language tests can also help develop some kind of assessment literacy, especially intuitions about how tests work from a test taker perspective, or how tests should look like according to input from teachers and learners. Right? So these are all important input or information that we need to consider when we design assessment literacy training programs. Okay, so to decompose the central question about LAL development, there are three questions that tend to ask. The first one is what to learn, because there's so many different components, right? And we've learned that stakeholders need not master all elements of LAL, but how do we select subcomponents? And the second question is, who do we learn assessment literacy from? And the last and the most important question, how do we actually learn? So I'll first propose a conceptual model that me and my colleague have developed from our research in the past few years. And then I'll gradually answer the three questions that I provided here in relation to our conceptual model, and also in reflection of the current research findings in LAL development. So a conceptual model that this conceptual model is based on work done by myself and my colleague, Jason Fun from Language Testing Research Center at the University of Melbourne. We've actually conducted quite a number of mostly qualitative research looking into how different stakeholders reflect upon their own professional development related to testing. And what we found is clearly that the development of language assessment literacy is contextualized, experiential, and reflective. And in fact, there are a lot of contextual variables and experiential variables that can actually mediate the development of assessment literacy. And what we also found from our recent work is that the impact of contextual factors is mediated through experiential factors. That is, it is the accumulation and reflection of assessment experience that counts when it comes to developing expertise in assessment literacy. So if you look at the model, and this is the figure that is coming out in an article that we just published in Language Testing. In this particular model, we in a very simple graph, we're describing how we think assessment literacy develops across stakeholder groups. That is, nobody actually comes with zero background in testing. Whether you've been a language learner or a language teacher, you're bound to have some experience or exposure to language testing, and you have some kind of perceptions about testing or how testing works. So you will have some initial assessment literacy or LAL to begin with, which is represented in the center here. With the prior assessment literacy that you have, all stakeholders tend to engage in some kind of assessment context where they will be faced with some kind of assessment tasks, whether or not it's language teachers being recruited to design a final exam for a language program, or language testing researchers who are given a task to design a new test to measure someone's language proficiency, or second language researchers trying to do an experiment to find out how kids develop in terms of their acquisition of X, right? Some kind of linguistic elements. So we all have some initial understanding or assumptions about how tests work. And then we can all, if we try a little harder, we can always create some kind of test to begin with, right? So that provides an initial solution to those assessment problems in the local context. But the initial try is never perfect. And there are always problems that you can find from the assessment that you develop, right? That's why through repeated practice and repeated trial and error, you start to accumulate assessment experience. And these experiences will tell you what tend to work and what tend not to work in your assessment context. And through reflections upon these assessment experience, and you start to develop more assessment literacy. And with that increased or enhanced assessment literacy, you can again develop better assessment solutions to solve the problems in your own context, right? So it's a very circular procedure, but through these procedures or this process, you develop an enhanced assessment literacy. And it's fairly easy to apply this model across all stakeholder groups. Just to give you an example here, and this is actually coming from our research findings. So to give you a little bit of background or context of our research, what we did is we interviewed multiple stakeholders or multiple individuals across 4 stakeholder groups in China, ranging from language testing professors at universities to students, Ph.D. students who are currently in an applied linguistics program. So we asked them lots of questions like, what do they think language testing is about? Have they heard of the term assessment literacy? If so, how would they define them? We also asked about their any experience-related assessment activities in their daily context and how they evaluate their strengths and weaknesses related to language assessment. Right? So based on those questions, we got a lot of reflectional data from our participants and from stakeholders. And what I'm showing now here is sort of a simplification or a description of the assessment literacy development process for a language testing professor at a key university in China. So the title is actually a quote that we took from her interview. And she said, "I became more aware of my weaknesses in language assessment literacy after I became a teacher and test coordinator." Right. So to describe her assessment literacy development process, so she started as a graduate student in language testing, and she took a bunch of language testing courses where she learned about assessment theory, measurement models. Then she quickly got involved in research projects with her professor. And then she learned item writing skills, statistical skills that enabled her to analyze data. And after she graduated, because she's from the research project, she was able to get a couple publications, and she was hired by her university as a faculty member immediately after graduation. But what's interesting is that she experienced quite a bit of challenge and shifts after she started working. That is, originally she thought language testing is all about modeling data. It's all about statistical analyses. And yet, when she started working as a faculty or university professor, she has to teach language courses, and she has to use or manage a local test and utilize the test in instructional context. Then she realized that actually classroom teaching becomes very important for assessment literacy because that's what she lacked. And even though she was able to analyze large-scale data, she had a hard time translating her testing expertise into teaching practices, meaning that she wasn't, even though she understood very well terms like reliability and validity, but if you think about assessment context in a classroom, she wasn't able to operationalize reliability and validity, at least to the same level of ease that she could do in large-scale data. And with more experience, she started to become more and more comfortable, finally able to integrate testing with teaching and learning, and she got promoted. And she became the test coordinator for their local university-based test, where she started to be involved in decision-making, policy-making, and then she realized that she needs to study more. And in her interview, she expressed that she needs more experience and better communication skills, because now she's not only talking to numbers and not just teachers and students, she also have to communicate with policymakers at the university level to ensure that their test is functioning well. So this is kind of a typical developmental trajectory for a language testing professional. That is, they start from something that is very theoretical and technical and gradually move on to talk about, to be involved in more sociocultural and sociopolitical contexts of test use. And when we asked her to evaluate her perceived strengths and weaknesses, and she was very quick to say that her strength had always been in measurement and statistics, but she realized that her weaknesses lie more in language pedagogy, teaching testing alignment, and communication with stakeholders. So we can see that we can easily apply this conceptual model in describing her development, right? So each stage of her work context, she is able to engage in different kind of assessment practice. And through reflections of these assessment experience and assessment practices, she was able to develop different elements of, or expertise in different elements of assessment literacy. So that's a typical example of a language tester. And in fact, this is kind of what I consider the ideal development trajectory for language testers in terms of assessment literacy. But is it always the case, or does this model apply to all language testers? Right? And that's the question that we always ask. That is, even though we know there are differences, but we're still not confident to assume that all language testers have the same assessment literacy profile or have the same developmental process. And especially we know from our neighboring fields and second language acquisition, we know that learners develop language proficiency or acquire language elements in many different ways. There are lots of individual differences, right? So that's the question that we start to ask further. And in fact, through our research, what we found is that even though language testing researchers tend to have higher proficiency or abilities in different elements of assessment literacy, it's never the case that all testers feel that they're well-rounded in all aspects of assessment literacy. And in fact, this aligns with a lot of scholars, especially who've published recently, to suggest that learning about assessment literacy, about language testing and assessment is an ongoing process that is mediated through assessment experience. And that principle applies to not only teachers, policymakers, but language testers as well. Right? So looking back, and especially if you think about the question that I asked early on, that is, do we really think that this well-rounded profile actually exists? Right? And we know seems so far from empirical research that such a well-rounded profile might be too ideal. Right? So it's kind of like the notion of the ideal native speaker that we have in understanding language acquisition, right? Especially the difference between competence and performance. So the same kind of assumption can be discussed here in the development of assessment literacy as well. Right? So we have to, so if we know that this perfect or well-rounded profile doesn't exist or doesn't always exist, how do we set expectations for all stakeholders, right? And how can we design a training program that fits to individual stakeholders' need so that they can develop assessment literacy that can help them in their own assessment context, right? So to give you another example, we are showcasing a different type of profile for language testing professors. And this is also a testing professor at a key university in China. So she graduated from a very reputable language testing program. That's where she obtained her Ph.D. degree. And her focus back then was in assessment and L2 writing theory. So clearly she worked on writing assessment. And again, through research projects, she's developed expertise in skill development and validation. But once she started teaching at a university, she started to become more interested in classroom-based writing assessment. And that's because she realized she's been dealing with classroom-based students all the time, and that's where her data is, and that's also what interests her in terms of assessment practice. But interestingly, she noted that because of her trajectory, the development trajectory, she had never taken classes related to quantitative skills or measurement modeling skills. She felt that she would rather learn more about advanced quantitative methods in order to handle large-scale data. And her specific reason for that is in her current work context, she needs those skills to be able to publish more journal articles to pass the promotion criteria. And this is also a very instrumental, a very a clear need for language testing professors. I guess there's no clear right or wrong paths for assessment literacy development, and this is a very legitimate reason as well, because that's the nature of academia. But clearly we can see by contrasting these two cases, or these two language testing professors, we can see that all testing professors, or so-called professional testers, will have different strengths and weaknesses. And to showcase this point a bit more, one of the drawbacks of assuming such a well-rounded and perfect profile of LAL for language testers is that it might discourage a lot of prospective language testers. By prospective language testers, I'm referring to, for example, graduate students in a Ph.D. programs in applied linguistics with a particular focus on language testing. And we've interviewed quite a couple of them actually in our study, and we found that, very interestingly, many language testing students refuse or feel afraid to call themselves language testers, because they just always have this fear that they will never learn enough to be qualified to be a language tester. And that's actually the title that I put for this talk. We've come such a long way to actually reach this point. That is, even language testers themselves might consider they lack expertise in language testing. And that's actually a dangerous sign, in my view, to our field. That is, we're creating these ideal profiles that nobody could actually reach. And that's actually detrimental to the professional development of language testing. So, back to our question, what to focus during assessment literacy development, right? So the key is to be realistic in designing or developing expectations. And my solution to developing realistic expectations has always been needs analysis. So you have to conduct some kind of needs assessment in your own context. And this has to be individualized or at a group level within that local context. So you have to first find out what assessment problems that you want to solve, and what assessment expertise and resources you have available. Right? So do you have professional testers in your group, or do you have people who are very experienced in teaching, or do you have lots of resources that you can actually use in designing tests? Right? By resources, oftentimes we are talking about funds, personnel, time, right? These are important resources that we need to consider. Are there any practical constraints in terms of personnel and policy, right? And many times universities might, for whatever reason, have policies that prevent you from using certain kind of assessment tasks. So those need to be considered. So also it's important to look at the stakeholders' prior assessment knowledge and skills. To see what they're good at, right? If, for example, you're trying to assess someone's oral speaking skills, and in many of your personnel or the stakeholders that you have in your local context are very experienced in developing or conducting interviews, then it's perhaps a good idea to stick with the format of interview rather than having, let's say, other creative formats of speaking, such as creating a semi-direct test that asks test takers to speak to a computer, right? So you really have to see what you have in your local context, and also be clear of the expected assessment outcomes and the score uses. So oftentimes, realistic expectations can be governed by the actual test use. For example, say you're trying to design a language placement test, and your goal is to place students who are coming into the university into two levels of language courses, high level and lower level courses. And in your case, then your assessment doesn't have to be so precise or so discriminating that it can separate multiple levels of proficiency, because all you need to do is to design a test that can distinguish between two groups of test takers, right, in terms of proficiency. And the reason why I say so is that it's actually very difficult to design a test that can discriminate people across multiple levels. If you only need 2 levels of courses or 2 levels of proficiency level, you better stick with 2 levels on your test. So all these elements need to be considered when you think about what to focus on developing assessment literacy skills. And based on these assessments, then you can decide what kind of assessment tasks you might want to use, and then learn and focus on just learning more about those assessment tasks. That'll be more efficient and effective. The next question is who to learn from. And this is a much simpler question, even though it also took the field much longer to realize. The traditional views of assessment literacy development is a very top-down approach, where the competencies of measurement is trickled down from assessment literate professionals, usually the testing experts, to the non-experts. So it's very rigid, very formal, and as you probably have in Thailand or in many other countries where you have these sort of professional development lectures where testing experts start to give training, teaching them how to do item analysis and give them a lot of lectures. Those formats tend to have lots of problems because it doesn't involve the learners or the trainees in actual assessment development experience. So Imbar Laurie in 2008 started to argue that we need to democratize assessment or assessment literacy training by following a bottom-up approach where the practices and knowledge of assessment should lie more equally among teachers, administrators, and other stakeholders. That is, there's always things that all stakeholders can learn from each other. Even the most professional or those most experienced item writers might have a lot to learn about the local context from maybe teachers or other members within the local context. And that's why they can always collaborate to create a solution or an assessment solution that can solve the problem that you have. So that leads to my next bullet point, which is it seems to, at least from prior research, that collaboration with testing experts is an effective way to learn about assessment literacy. And in our research, we also emphasize that it's a combination of collaboration and apprenticeship that actually make non-experts or other stakeholders develop assessment literacy more quickly. And this apprenticeship doesn't need to come from testing experts. It can come from anyone who is experienced in solving assessment problems within your local context. It could be experienced teachers who have been involved in designing final exams or quizzes for this course, or it could be anyone who's been in the local context who knows the test taker population very well, right? So all these expertise and experience will contribute to finding or selecting the best assessment solution. So how to learn? It's important to accumulate and reflect upon assessment experience, right? As the model suggests, even though the traditional view is a much top-down approach, and even though for some stakeholders, they can learn pretty quickly from a deductive approach, meaning they will start from something very theoretical and then gradually move on to something more practical. It's, at least from our findings, from our empirical research over the past few years, it's more common for language teachers or other stakeholders to learn about assessment in an inductive way or an inductive approach, where they start from assessment experience and gradually develop assessment intuitions or perceptions about assessment concepts and assessment principles. So, as I said, it's very difficult to actually have a list of things that teachers need to learn, right? So, and for that, you need to probably have to engage in a much longer process than just 90 minutes. But here, I want to show you an actual encouraging example of a universal level English teacher who had no prior testing background, but finally was able to develop assessment literacy from experience and reflection. So Huang is a tertiary level or universal level English teacher Those of you who are familiar with the Chinese context might be able to relate to this kind of faculty position right away. That is in a lot of the English, or for college English education in China. And you will have teachers who are teaching English courses to all students at college. Some of the faculty members will have background in TESOL or applied linguistics, whereas other faculty members might have background in literature, cultural studies, or translation, right? So if faculty members are coming from those areas, they might not have taken any assessment-related courses. And they might not even have a lot of experience teaching language courses when they start working. And that was the case for Huang. Even though she's had 15 years of teaching experience, when she started, she had zero background, zero experience, because her background was in literature, and she had to teach a translation class to non-English majors. And she had very little assessment training when she started. But she quickly or gradually became aware of and became more comfortable with a classroom-based assessment with accumulated experience. And here's how she developed assessment literacy. So an example I want to actually show is how she designed peer assessment for her classroom assessment activities. So she was teaching a graduate level interpretation courses where she had 30 students. And this course has two major assignments, translation assignments, one from English to Chinese, the other one from Chinese to English. And there's a midterm exam and there's a final exam. So Huang had little control over midterm exam and final exams because that's standardized across all courses at the university. And that's been determined by the college and not so much by her. So there's little flexibility. But she had a lot of control over the major assignments that she had in the class. So when she started, and she didn't consider this flexibility as a blessing, and in fact, she was quite frustrated because she didn't know what to do. She wanted to follow some kind of criteria or some kind of materials that previous teachers used. But unfortunately, she didn't have any. So she started by using impressionistic ratings. That is, she asked students to translate from English to Chinese and from Chinese to English. Then she would just rate those interpretations without any rating rubric, without any kind of guidelines for what's considered good, what's considered poor translation, all according to her impressionistic rating. Then she quickly realized, or at least she noticed, that there are a lot of students complaining about their course grades. Or students felt frustrated because they couldn't find out what's important when they complete those translation assignments. So they hope to learn something from their test scores or their assignment grade, but there wasn't anything systematic. So she designed an idea. Well, how about if we think about what's important to us and get students involved in this evaluation procedure and just trying to see what everybody comes up with, right? So then she started to have teacher plus peer assessment for his class. And she, through this experience, she realized there's great variability in terms of how everybody evaluate performances. And there's a lack of inconsistency even within herself as a teacher. And that's a clear reliability issue. And she also felt there's a lot of rater bias for her. That is, she cared a lot about handwriting. And if students turn in an assignment that's written in very good handwriting without any crossings, and she might, it's more likely that she will assign higher scores to these students' homeworks. So she realized there's fairness issues related to her impressionistic rating, and she hoped that having peer assessment can actually address this. But once she practiced peer assessment for a while, she realized she needs to standardize the grading rubric because not everyone is using the same criteria. And it still doesn't solve the problem if students come back to her and ask her, why am I losing points here? What can I do to make my grades higher? Or what can I do to learn more about translation skills or interpretation skills? So she started to draft a grading rubric. and started to use that in class. So what she did at the beginning is she used that to grade her own assignments, and she just give the rubric to all the students and ask them to conduct grading on their own. This is a big improvement that students started to try to align to the grading rubric, but she quickly noticed also that the students had a hard time understanding what the grade rubric means, because it was written in a language that is familiar to her, but not necessarily to the students. So to solve this problem, she started to develop some very creative formative views of assessment. So she started to teach or use this grading rubric as part of her instructional material. She will ask students to actually go over the grading rubric and try to see if they understand the rubric the same way she does. And she used this as a good teaching moment. And by doing this, she is actually conducting rater training to all her students, especially in terms of peer assessment. And she noticed that this procedure helped increase the level of agreement between students' ratings and her ratings. And every semester, she also used what she considered the benchmark performances in the class to teach students. So with more experience, she was not only able to ask students to interpret the grading rubric, she was also able to show examples of translation or interpretation work at different levels on the grading rubric. So you can see this process seems to be a standard procedure that someone would follow, right, in classroom-based assessment. But it actually took her 2 years to came to this realization that this is a much better assessment procedure or protocol than what she had to begin with, which was just complete impressionistic grading. And you might reasonably question that, you know, if you have a top-down training procedure or assessment training class, you can easily tell teachers that this procedure can be followed, and you don't really need 2 years to complete this task. Well, that's true. I've been thinking about that as well. But what's interesting is that without this experience, it's more difficult for Huang to actually develop self-reflection or awareness of assessment literacy, as it can be demonstrated in her quote here. So we ask her, why did you provide training in peer assessment? Here's her response. And this is a translation from Chinese to English. And she said, I developed this assessment method from practice. After all, when you evaluate anything or anyone, you need when you evaluate anything or anyone, you need a criterion, a standard, right? Otherwise, how can you make a judgment? I'm not sure if this is a good analogy, but it's like when you're trying to ask people to find you a spouse. You might have certain standards or criteria in mind, like personality, physical appearance, income. You can have many dimensions, but in any case, if you want others to be your matchmaker, you have to let them know your own criteria and explain to them what those criteria mean, right? So this is kind of the reasoning or rationale behind her. And this is actually very important when you think about assessment literacy. That is, it's not just about getting those practical skills, but also knowing the reasons behind it, right? And that's key to developing assessment literacy. We've seen so many practitioners, even language testers, who've been quite skilled at crunching numbers, modeling data, but if you ask them to communicate why they're doing these analyses, many of them aren't able to express the rationale behind those procedures. And to me, that's actually a quite failure in terms of assessment literacy development, because the ultimate goal is to understand why you want to perform certain kind of procedures. And that's exactly shown in Huang's reflection here. And I will show more example here. So when talking about fairness, right, this is a term that she actually developed without us mentioning. And she said, I don't want favoritism to influence students' grades. And that's really coming from her own experience. And she said, I record students' performances, assign them to a group of 6, and ask each student to grade their groupmates' performances. They use grading rubric as we discussed, and each student will receive 6 scores on each criterion. Then she will take the average. And this way, even if her score is biased, it will only carry a small weight on the final grades that students receive. And she said, I want to maintain fairness in the grading process. Right? So this is her way of combating reader bias so that she can get a relatively unbiased estimate of someone's interpretation skills. And again, this is the quotes in terms of our formative use of assignments in class. As you can see that her goal is really to provide some model performances for students and so that they can motivate them to learn more about interpretation skills and try to practice more. And the final question that we asked each participant was, how do they evaluate their assessment literacy? And Juan's response was very interesting. She said, even though she's gathered all these systematic procedures and developed these procedures from scratch, and she still said she's not confident about language assessment knowledge and practice. She feels that language assessment is a very specialized field. It is always about large data sets, very complicated statistics and math. And she said she cannot handle these heavy quantitative methods, and she's more comfortable with words than numbers. And I believe this is a common perception from stakeholders, even including language testing students. Right, the case that I showcased earlier said pretty much the same thing. When we asked students about their perceptions of language testing as a field, some of the interesting responses that we got include, well, testing is all about quantitative skills. This is a field where people can make a lot of money because now many companies hire people with heavy quantitative skills or programming skills, which is something that is really surprising to us. In that the field has come such a long way to realize that language testing expertise is not just about technical skills, and it's certainly not just about statistics. So maybe focusing on this aspect or setting realistic goals for stakeholders can actually help build confidence among stakeholders to convey the message that language testing is not that difficult and that many people can actually develop expertise in assessment as well. And when we asked them what kind of training that she preferred, and Juan said, if it's about quantitative and theoretical knowledge, and she's probably not very interested, but she believes if the training is embedded in assessment practices or has a strong association with teaching and learning, she will be able to learn a lot more about assessment. So based on this example, and in fact, she's not alone, we find this as a general pattern. That is, we've never had any stakeholders that clearly indicated that assessment training without hands-on experience works the best. So if assessment experience is so important, how can we actually have some practical suggestions for training? Here I'm listing some of the examples that covers perhaps the most popular topics or the most important topics in assessment that teachers and testers need to be involved in on a regular basis. These elements include assessment purpose and tasks, concepts of reliability, validity, and fairness, and analysis and use of test scores, and how tests impact teaching and learning. So I try to make a distinction between tester and teachers so that we can see the differences or how we can set realistic expectations between testers and teachers. So when it comes to assessment purpose and tasks, we can sort of envision that the goal for testers should be the design and the examination of language tasks. Right? So there's much more in-depth analysis of how tasks work. But for language teachers, for example, the goal can be focused on selecting appropriate language tasks to solve the assessment problem at hand, or how to modify existing tests or tasks to create a new test. In terms of reliability, validity, and fairness principles, for language testers, it's very important to operationalize these concepts quantitatively, especially when large-scale data is involved. And it's more important for them to interpret these indices qualitatively to different stakeholder groups. It's the communication and the interpretation that matters. But for language teachers, perhaps the focus could be on identifying pedagogical practices that violate key assessment principles, and then reinforce reflectional practices that prompt regular checks of reliability, validity, and fairness in your assessment practices. Regarding analysis and use of test scores, for testers, the focus could be on examining the psychometric qualities of test scores, like conducting item analysis, modeling of data. But for teachers, maybe the focus can be on the interpretation of test scores of their students in comparison with their daily performance in the classroom settings. And also to understand, even though teachers might not need to perform item analysis, but the focus could be on understanding the concepts of item difficulty and item discrimination, just to see how much information teachers can gain from students' test scores and item scores, right? How that can be used to help with teaching and learning. So then about impact of testing. Right? For testers, the focus could be on examining the macro level of washback effect, right? Looking at how tests can influence teaching and learning as a whole. But for language teachers, more attention should be given to how a test influences individual students and design instructional adjustments according to their performance on a particular test. So these are some simple contrasts I'm throwing out here. It's by no means to be comprehensive. There's got to be a lot more topics that we can list under this table, but hopefully that'll give you an idea. That is for teachers or so-called non-testing experts. We don't have to shy away from all these concepts or principles simply because they tend to be technical conventionally. And our focus could be on understanding these concepts and translating them into pedagogical practices, right? And in order to do this, it will be very beneficial if teachers can collaborate with language testers, or novice teachers can collaborate with experienced language teachers to actually better understand these assessment concepts and principles. So what do we actually need when we think about assessment development, or suggestions that go beyond practical topics for our stakeholders? Number one is you need to have confidence. As I've been argued repeatedly, language testing is not just about statistics or measurement. And although these technical skills are an important part of language testing expertise, it doesn't mean that all stakeholders need to master technical skills related to language testing. And if a language tester only knows these technical skills, it's actually a sign of very poor language assessment literacy for these language testers, because a well-rounded language tester, or an ideal profile for language testers, is not only they are able to handle technical skills, but also they're able to communicate with non-testing experts about score meaning, about how to read technical reports of language tests, and how they can translate assessment language into pedagogical language so that testing and teaching can be better aligned. And the second important advice is try to get more assessment experience. I know it has been my experience when talking to different stakeholders that because of this underlying concerns about not knowing statistical numbers, they tend to shy away from involvement in assessment practice. And my point is you should not be afraid of being involved in assessment practice. And in fact, you should work with multiple people, or as many people as possible, to see how others handle assessment tasks. And from those experiences, you might be able to develop your own assessment knowledge from reflections. Self-reflection and translation is important. I'm not talking about translation between, say, English to Chinese or from English to Thai, but I'm talking about translation of assessment language. Through self-reflection, you can develop your own assessment language. That is, you don't have to follow the technical terms that is being used by language testing experts, but it's important to know what those terms mean and link your assessment experience to those terms. Then through reflection, you can understand those terms better and translate them into your own language or language that is shared within your immediate stakeholder groups. There are lots of examples from my own experience working with language teachers in developing classroom assessment practices or rating scales that they use to score essays in language classes. I can see that oftentimes the terms that I used or the scale descriptors that I used at the very beginning are translated into something that looks quite different from the original version. But that's fine, as long as there's that equivalence or that is being established between my version of assessment or scale to teacher's version of assessment. It's fine, because at the end of the day, it's the practice that actually matters. And when you develop knowledge and expertise in your own assessment practice, make sure you contribute back to the community. Because in terms of assessment literacy training, we actually lack a lot of experienced teachers or stakeholders who have expertise in testing, because there's always a gap between, or there can be easily a gap between language testers or non-testing experts, because you lack that mutual context of practice. So if we have experienced language teachers, and these experienced language teachers can actually participate in assessment training for novice language teachers. Same works for other stakeholder groups like policymakers, in terms of how all stakeholders can better understand language testing and assessment. So at the end of the talk, I want to do some shameless self-promotion. So I have two recommended readings here. These are two books, and the reason I recommended these two books are because these two books are written specifically for non-testing experts. And the first one is written by an emeritus professor from Harvard University. It's called Measuring Up. This is a very widely used textbook or a fun book to read if you have spare time, because it covers a very comprehensive range of assessment topics, but it's not written in technical language. And in fact, you're going to have a hard time finding numbers in this entire book. Same goes with a book that me and my colleagues recently published. So this book is called Local Language Testing. It's about design, implementation, and development of local tests. The authors are Slobodanka Domova from the University of Copenhagen, and myself, and April Ginther from Purdue University. So these are the two books that, in my view, that are specifically written for non-testing experts. And it's very different from most testing books you will see on the market, because most other books tend to be quite technical. So in case you want to read more about language testing, these are some fun readings that you can have over the summer. All right, so that's all I've prepared for today's talk. So thank you very much for joining this webinar. I thank you very much for listening through this very long presentation. Now, if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, I'm very happy to take them.